think they're killing people.
The medical examiner says the hostages were apparently killed by large caliber ammunition and shotgun blasts, had been shot down by the lawmen who broke in to rescue them.
On September 9th, 1971, Attica State Prison would become the focal point of a national investigation. A prison riot erupted, resulting in 128 men shot and dozens dead. But not because of rioters, but the people in charge of stopping the riot. So for today, we're going to be talking about the Attica State Prison Riot. The reason I'm talking about it today is because it is the prison riot with the highest fatalities in U.S. history of all prison riots ever in all of the United States. This prison riot resulted in 43 total deaths, 33 inmates, 10 correction guards, and several employees and staff. 90% of these casualties were at the hand of the state police, not the rioters. Now, this riot started for a lot of different reasons, but mainly the collective reason was they were demanding better living conditions, better standards, an end to the abuse that they were receiving from the staff, and just generally being treated as human beings.
Set forth to change forever the ruthless brutalization and disregard for the lives of the prisoners here and throughout the United States.
For context, this took place in the 70s. It was very politically motivated, and given that the 70s was the tail end of the hippie movement and the tail end of the Vietnam War, the political activism in the country had taken quite a militant turn, had become organized to sort of fit that mold. That being said, some of the major leaders or figureheads within this riot were predominantly black and predominantly in the Black Power movement or the Black Panther Party, or some were in a new group that had just recently formed called the New Left Movement. It was a left-wing political group really aimed to fighting against the war on drugs and the war on crime. These tended to be the overarching players involved within the riot, though many people were involved for their own individual gain or reason. So it wasn't all entirely politics. Some of it was just people just wanted to get, higher paying jobs. Prior to the riot, left-wing historian, don't know why they included that detail in there, but since it's there, I figure I might as well say it. A man named Howard Zinn, when asked about the prison conditions at Attica, said this:
Attica was a rebellion that came from long, deep grievances. 54% of the inmates were black. 100% of the guards were white. Prisoners spent 14 to 16 hours a day in their cells. Their mail was read, their reading material restricted, their visits from families conducted through a mesh screen, their medical care disgraceful, their parole system inequitable, and racism everywhere.
From the moment I got there, I was conscious of the racial prejudice.
I want you to remember that last one because it becomes very important later in this story. And of course, like most prisons, if not in the United States, the world, overcrowding was a massive problem. I mean, the facility was built and rated to house 1,200 inmates, and at the time of the riot, there was a whopping 2,243 of them, so nearly doubled it.
Attica was a nightmare. Conditions, overcrowded.
So leading up to this riot, you might be thinking or have some preconceived notion that, the riot just broke out and they tried to turn it into a political statement or moment of activism. No, not really. As much as I wish I could say it was that simple, it's not. A group of inmates about 2 to 3 months prior to the riot came together and wrote up a list of demands, 27 of them to be exact. They brought this to the commissioner of the Department of Corrections, the governor, as well as the warden. Their demands were ignored. They pretty much just spit in their face, told them to get the fuck out, and never to even mention any of those things.
The conditions at Attica were awful. There were no education programs. There were no people of color as guards. The medical care was horrendous. There were all sorts of grievances, and there was a group of people who wrote these grievances down and attempted to get to the state to look at them, and the state refused to look at them, and the entire prison was taken over.
Once they brought the demands and just flat out ignored them, they then, in order to retaliate after bringing up such despicable demands of not having to sleep with rats and roaches and eat food that is, at the very least, edible. Well, they begin clamping down with more reading restrictions and more restrictions on personal belongings, so a little foreshadowing for the future. On September 8th, 1971, 2 inmates engage in an argument that grows into a physical altercation. The fight ended quickly, resulting in 1 inmate remaining while another walked away after the scuffle. Responding guard Lieutenant Maroney intervenes, ordering the remaining inmate to a cell. Another argument begins, rapidly escalating into another physical altercation between the guard and the inmate this time. Additional guards and inmates inject themselves into the ever-increasing fight. Yet, before the situation fully explodes, Lieutenant Curtis calms the situation back into order. As the assault grew bigger and more intense, it eventually began spreading to other cell blocks throughout the prison. In only a few minutes, only one word echoed throughout Attica State Prison: riot. Now, with several guards and inmates injured, one officer unfortunately would go on to pass away in the hospital 2 days later after this altercation, but now, for the remaining guards and inmates, it was do or die. By noon of the same day, over 1,200 inmates controlled over half of Attica State Prison in key locations, one of them being the Command and Communication Center, which allowed inmates to open doors and have access to cameras. In addition to holding these strategic locations, as well as the broader territory of the prison, they also housed 42 hostages, including guards, staff, and employees. The inmates have now secured their territory on this new de facto front line. Their next step was organizing, promoting leaders to represent the inmates, as well as protect them and their most valuable assets. In charge of security was Frank Big Black Smith, tasked with protecting the section of Attica the inmates controlled and ensuring that they did not lose or allow any hostages to be harmed. These were key to their demands even being considered or let alone met or heard publicly. Other duties were also being dished out, jobs including medics and soldiers. The mouthpiece for this uprising was a passionate, engrossing speaker, a 21-year-old Elliot James L.D. Barkley. An articulate and sharp speaker acted as the voice, speaking for the demands of the inmates in an elegant way in order to capture the public opinion. A list of 33 demands were drawn up by the inmates, headed by 5 individuals: Donald Noble, Peter Butler, Frank Lott, Carl Jones, and Herbert Blyden. A compilation of ideas were brought together, but ended up agreeing upon 33 demands ranging from better sanitation, living conditions, and food, to higher job wages for inmates, and an end to their physical and psychological abuse from staff. However, there were 2 non-negotiable demands. One was the removal of the acting warden, as well as amnesty for inmates who played a role in the riot. Now, with the prison riot in full swing, half the prison being controlled by inmates and 42 hostages under their thumb, they began making demands and calling the shots, essentially. The prison was practically entirely under their control, as well as the initiative of the riot. They began demanding media and certain figureheads to meet them publicly and to help speak and amplify their message. Now, negotiations would begin. First, they began smoothly. Ironically, the 27 demands that they had made 3 or 4 months prior to this riot, all of a sudden they're very receptive and accepting. Now they're willing to accept, in fact, 28 of them. However, the 2 that they will not accept were the 2 non-negotiables, of course. This obviously put quite the wrench in the negotiations. They continued between Governor Rockefeller, as well as a negotiator for the commissioner of the Department of Corrections. Before they knew it, negotiations had rapidly broke down between the governor, as well as the commissioner, and the inmates. They no longer could see eye to eye and no longer were able to agree on any of the demands. For several hours of negotiation, Rockefeller and Oswald, the commissioner, would meet for the last time. Rockefeller ordered the commissioner to meet with the inmates one last time to give them a final message of surrender. If they refused this, then the assault would begin. Oswald begged the governor for just one more day of speaking with them, thinking that they could probably end on a peaceful negotiation and work something out. Rockefeller was not having that. Patience had worn thin, and he demanded that Oswald go and give them their last message before their impending doom was soon to come. Weirdly, Rockefeller demanded that Oswald frame this last message to the inmates in a subtle and less direct way as to not alert them of the impending assault that would come down on them just a few hours later. On Monday, September 13th, 1971, at 8:25 a.m., Oswald sends his last message to the inmates: a last chance to surrender and to release the hostages. The inmates ignored this and walked 8 hostages out onto the catwalk in a display of defiance. Oswald, having no other options, gave the order for the assault to commence, describing this feeling as a microcosm to how Truman must have felt when dropping the A-bomb. At 9:46 a.m. of the same day, tear gas was released on the facility. A motley crew of law enforcement engaged the inmates. Everything from state troopers, criminal investigation personnel, sheriff deputies, park police, and correction guards. All of law enforcement fired live ammunition through the smoke, unloading 12-gauge buckshot rounds and soft-point pistol and rifle rounds, striking any and everything in its path, wounding and killing inmates as well as hostages. By 10:05 a.m., the gunfire stopped. With the smoke cleared, what remained disturbed everyone who bore witness. 128 men were shot, 9 hostages were killed, and a 10th would later to go on and die in a hospital just 1 month later from wounds sustained on that day, and including 29 inmates were also killed. Now, with the riot sufficiently tamped down in probably the most heavy-handed and brutal way you could do it, the responding officers within the prison, at least some of them, I can't speak for all of them, then proceeded to essentially go on a hunting spree, began chasing down and lurking on any inmates that they could find. Any ones that were of value and had prominence within the riot were systematically hunted down and shot.
On the leadership of the rebels, we are probably going to have a statement on this later on this afternoon, and we'll be getting in touch with you as to how we'll give that statement.
Now, I want to preface this with a big fat allegedly. The only testimonies of these were from inmates, and later investigations wouldn't produce much. However, multiple inmates had corroborating stories of a select few officers chasing down at least 2 men, L.D. Barkley, who was shot and killed in the back, while allegedly guards ran through the prison facility screaming for his name and demanding for him to surrender. Another man, Sam Melville, other inmates claimed that he was shot while surrendering with his hands up in the air and in the process of kneeling. He unfortunately was also killed. As far as the true number on exactly how many were shot and killed and executed by law enforcement, we'll never truly know. Even through all the investigations, no hard fact number has ever come out, nor has anybody ever had charges brought to them for this. After all was said and done, the final casualty list was this. The final casualty report was 171 total casualties, 32 inmates dead, 10 hostages, 1 officer, and 128 men with various gunshot wounds.
We have a total number of dead now recorded at 41. This is the total number of dead. This includes 10 hostages and 31 inmates.
Yeah, that's not police response. That's a fucking firefight, dude. That's like Fallujah numbers. Typically when you get numbers like that, they usually starts with a car bomb, not essentially a militia of different law enforcements all schwacked together who just spearheaded a fucking prison riot with live rounds and somehow managed to kill more hostages than the inmates did. I don't know how you fucked that one up, but boy howdy, did you ever. So rightfully so, in the ensuing hours after this, people weren't very happy. Now, unfortunately, though it didn't last very long, the police as well as the governor all reported that all the hostages that were killed that day were because of inmates, that upon their assault into the facility, the inmates panicked and immediately started slicing the throats of all the hostages.
In the final hours of the revolt, led primarily by blacks, the inmates murdered 9 of their white hostages. 28 convicts were killed by state troopers and sheriff's deputies who regained control of the prison.
Now, if you have half a fucking brain, you're probably going to look at a dead body that has a bunch of 9mm and 5.56 holes in them and go, well, that didn't happen with a knife. But that wouldn't happen till later. Now, in solidarity of the inmates who unfortunately lost their lives, inmates in other prisons would go on to hold their own protests and riots, as well as go on hunger strikes and do anything they can to really support this, including civilians. Even family members of inmates at Attica and other prisons held their own peaceful protests outside of the prison. this would have a sort of butterfly effect. If you are familiar with the kind of left-wing militant group, I guess you'd call them, the Weather Underground, after hearing this, took it upon themselves for a retaliation attack and planted a bomb outside of the Commissioner Oswald, outside of his office, detonating it. Did not kill anybody, didn't hurt anybody, but probably scared the shit out of them. But this was a pretty big deal in the United States. This was not a one-off event that people were going to forget about. It made national news. It spread far and wide across the United States. In order to properly quell the now mounting public backlash for this event, the governor decided to set up a special task force in order to investigate what happened at this riot, in the hopes that maybe it would shine a better light on the departments involved and the commissioner and kind of put people's imaginations to rest. It didn't. It really did not. In fact, it did quite the opposite. It just highlighted the total incompetence they had in the situation. The findings of the report said that the department acted in complete and total negligence, as well as completely failed to properly handle the situation. Failed in regard of protecting the hostages, failed in the regard of properly quelling the riot, and said that their actions seemed more retaliatorial than they did actually disarming.
The prison said 8 of the hostages had had their throats cut, but today the Monroe County medical examiner, having looked at the bodies, said no throats were cut at all. The medical examiner says the hostages were apparently killed by large caliber ammunition and shotgun blasts from a distance, which immediately raised the possibility that some of the hostages may in fact have been shot down by the lawmen who broke in to rescue them.
Now, for some odd reason, the only criticism Oswald was willing to admit to was the mistake of allowing sheriff's deputies and the actual correctional guards at Attica to be involved in the assault, saying that that was one mistake he regrets and wish he could take back. It certainly was. It wasn't the smart move, mostly because a lot of the sheriff deputies, as well as the prison guards at Attica that were involved in this, were, we can say, a bit racially motivated. Following this just absolute shit show of an investigation. Unfortunately, though, this task force, albeit being fairly transparent on one end of the reporting, complete and totally lied on the other, and essentially went through nailing every inmate they could get their hands on with every charge possible. I believe about 68 in total inmates were charged with a litany of felonies, some of which were days from release, and or some that had played little to no role in the actual riot beyond just feeding people, who were also hit with charges. But a prosecutor involved in this task force went on to write a report to the newly elected Governor Carey that he believes that the investigators involved in this were covering up information as well as trying to hide their previous mistakes. So Governor Carey took this and went to the Supreme Court, and he appointed a Supreme Court judge to head his own investigation of the special task force. There wasn't much produced from it. There was no evidence of cover-ups or attempts to hide any information. However, his one criticism was the department totally failed in regards of properly handling evidence, and much of the information that he should have had access to was either damaged or no longer could be found. So as far as, are they innocent? Definitely not. But is everything everybody says, are they totally guilty of that? Who knows? Nobody does, unfortunately. The only silver lining to this event, fortunately, is the family members of the hostages, as well as some of the surviving hostages, all eventually were compensated through lawsuits. It took about 20 years for it to actually happen, but pretty much all of them were paid out as far as I could tell. I believe the final payout was $24 million spread out across all of the families. Unfortunately, though, the inmates received nothing. Not only were their demands not met, a significant portion of them have now new gunshot wounds or were killed. Most of them were nailed with new charges on top of that. So they didn't get their demands. They were either killed or damn near killed, and now have to do an even longer sentence at the same facility. A lot of the inmates burned part of the facility, so some of them had to be removed and sent other places. But regardless, to do all of that, catch extra charges, nearly die for nothing, to gain nothing, to get nothing, to just have to go back either somewhere else or right back in the same place and just sit there and just eat it some more. And lastly, you might be thinking, oh my God, one of these officers had to have gotten in trouble. Somebody had to have fucked up enough that the courts had to have come down on him and maybe there was some sort of justice. No. In fact, only one officer was charged out of almost 400 of them who were involved in this massacre. Only one was charged. Do you know what he was charged for? He was charged for reckless endangerment. You can get that same charge playing with fireworks improperly. And these guys were just blind firing rifle rounds and shotguns into who knows what. And out of 400 plus, only one was charged with reckless endangerment. And I don't even think he served a minute of jail time. I'm fairly confident, probably worked down to a probation. But as she goes, story of what happened at Attica in 1971 would unfortunately be sealed up and eventually forgotten by the public as well as the judicial system. With that being said, I want to thank you for your time. Thank you for watching. I do appreciate it. And as always, if there's anything I can do to improve this, anything you would like to hear, any stories or topics talked about, please leave a comment below. I would greatly appreciate it. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.